We got Pope John Paul II tonight, who is, he's a huge saint. And I don't mean because he was extraordinarily tall, I just mean that he just had an incredible influence on possibly more people than anybody else had. Arguably, people will say that he was maybe the most important person in the 20th century. So that's a big statement, okay? And he would be the last one to tell you that because he was a very humble man, but he also was a very smart man. So what I want to do is I just want to kind of start with this story here. I'm going to read you the opening part of this book. This is a really good book. I would highly recommend it. It's called St. John Paul the Great, His Five Loves. It's written by Jason Everett, who's a Catholic speaker. If you start going to youth conferences, you will undoubtedly run into Jason. He has a ton of videos online. High schoolers right now are doing a program where he's one of the authors of it right now. So really good book though. I mean, I literally read this book the first time in like 2 days. Not because I'm a prolific reader, but because it was so interesting and so well written. It just really kind of captured my imagination. I went back and reread it to prepare this talk for DTS last week, and I read probably 2/3 of it in about a day and a half amongst everything else. It's just a really, really good book. So I want to start off with kind of how he starts off about John Paul. All right. It says, on the evening of May 18th, 1920, parishioners of the Church of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary gathered to sing evening prayer. Across the street, 36-year-old Amelia Voy-TEE-wah was in labor at home and noticed the sound of hymns in honor of the Virgin Mary emanating from the church. She asked her midwife to open the window in order for the songs to be heard. Amidst the sacred music, she delivered a son, Karol Joseph Wojtyla. So this took place in Poland in a city called Wadowice. And so, they were, they weren't rich, they weren't poor, they were just kind of somewhere in between. His father was a retired army officer, and so he had a pension. And his parents were a little bit older because Karol was the third child. He had a brother, Edmund, who was 14 years older than him, and then he had a sister that died before he was born. And so I think it said she was 36 years old when he was born. And so, they lived a modest life. And now when Karol was 8 years old, his mother died. She had had some illnesses and she died. And so from that time on, he would say that his father became a man of very deep prayer. He spent a lot of time just praying. And they were Catholic, and so they would spend a lot of time, because the church was nearby, they would go to the church and they would spend time praying there as well. Karol's brother Edmund became a doctor. Again, he was 11 years older than Karol. So when Karol was 11 and Edmund was about 25 or 26, Edmund was a doctor at a nearby hospital, and he contracted scarlet fever from one of the patients, and he died. And so now, by the time he's 11 years old, it's just him and his dad left. And so Karol, from the time that his mom died, really felt like, he developed a strong devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, because in prayer he said, since my mom's gone, now you're going to be my mom. And so he spent a lot of time praying to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and learned his rosary, did all that. Poland's a very Catholic country. It was then too. I mean, it was even more then than it is now. Probably 80 to 90% of the population was Catholic. It just was the way it was. And the country itself had gone through a lot of tumultuous times over the previous 400 or 500 years. It was invaded, it was free, then it was taken over, then it was occupied, then it was free. And the borders just kept changing like the weather over that time period. But the Polish culture somehow still was maintained throughout that time. And so this was in one of those times. This is 1920, is right after World War I. World War I mostly took place west of there, kind of in France and Belgium and Germany and that. But there were certainly skirmishes that happened in Poland as well. But the borders had once again changed, and some of the countries in the area were kind of scrambling for land, and things were going back and forth that way. And so throughout the 20s and 30s, it was a time of relative peace and prosperity during that time, but this was also during the rise of fascism in Germany and in Italy. And so Poland bordered Germany, and so there was always this fear, that if Germany kind of rose to power, that something bad could happen. And certainly as the 30s progressed, it looked like that's the direction it was heading So in 1939, he was done with high school and he started at the university. And in September of 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. Okay, and so this was super bad, because by this time people pretty much knew what the Nazis were about, and it was about a lot of bad things happening. And so on September 1st, they invaded, and within 3 weeks they had completely taken over Poland. They just ran right through, and they were cruel about it. They would literally, as people were evacuating the towns, they would fly over in planes and they would strafe them. They would drop bombs on them. They would just kill them. They were all about trying to destroy the Polish culture, and they were all about assimilating all of the resources of Poland into their own. And so it was a very brutal time. When this all started taking place, Karol, again, he was at the university, he ran home trying to make sure his dad was okay, and they had a basement apartment at the time, and his dad was fine. And so they just prayed together, and they really kind of hunkered down and did what they could. And his father was really adamant. He says, you need to get a work permit, because he had heard that the Nazis would either force your labor or they would kill you, basically. And so he said, if you get a work permit, then you will always be guaranteed of a job, and it will keep you safe. And so he did. And it turned out later on that was very fortuitous that he did that, because they literally would come into places, gather up everybody who was there, and if you had a work permit, you got to go back to work. If you didn't have a work permit, they would either imprison you or they would kill you, because they felt like these young men could rise up and help be a resistance against the government. And so it was a very, very brutal time. In early 1940, Karol came home once to their apartment, and he found his father dead. His father died of a heart attack, and he was probably only in his early 50s at the time. And so Karol later commented, he said, by the time I was 20 years old, I lost everybody I loved. And so he kind of his friends rallied around him, and they formed a theater group, to kind of try and hold together some of their culture. And, they did this, and at first I kind of thought, why a theater group? But this is one of the ways that the Polish culture had survived through all of the invasions and all of the occupations, is that they would write these plays and tell these stories and put on these performances, and that's the way that the culture was maintained through these times. Now, that said, the Nazis made these types of things illegal, so they had to practice and produce these and perform them underground. But they did it anyway. They felt it was that important. And so Karol, with his work permit then, he was working at a rock quarry. And this was not like now where they've got all this heavy machinery. They literally had sledgehammers and were just busting rocks. They were making gravel, they were doing all sorts of different things. And they did this year round. So some of the winters in Poland are kind of like the winters here. It can get really brutally cold. And temperatures like 20 below are not uncommon during the winter. And so he had a pair of wooden shoes, just regular pants, and he would smear petroleum jelly all over his face so he didn't get frostbite. And he went out and he worked, and he did what he needed to do. And so during this time, he started, he was really becoming pretty angry about stuff, because he's like, these people invaded our country, we're basically slaves in our own land, and some of his friends are talking about taking up arms. And so he was just really starting to feel that. I mean, who wouldn't, right? I mean, that's normal. You want to fight back, and there is a time for that. It's justified to fight back when things like that happen, but they were so outnumbered and so overwhelmed, it would have been a death sentence to him to do that. But anyway, so he went to confession at the church he was a member of, and the churches were still open, but only kind of at the pleasure of the Nazis. Basically, they had come in and they wanted to shut them down, but they knew that if they totally extinguished the Catholic faith, that it would be the source of a great uprising at some point in time. And so they kind of tolerated it, and they allowed 2 masses per week to be said in each church. But they also said that you cannot train any more priests. The priests that you have are the priests that you have. And so, and at the same time, though, they would conveniently round up priests and they would disappear. They would go off to work camps. They would go off to some of the gas chambers. They would just disappear. So, we hear a lot about, the persecution of the Jews, and there was a huge persecution of the Jews. But there's a lot of other races that were too. Anybody who was basically a person of color, they were rounded up as well. Anybody who was mentally disabled in some way, they were rounded up too. If you were Catholic, you were just as much of a target being Catholic as you were anything else, because Hitler knew that the Catholic Church was a potential enemy of his, and he knew that he needed to extinguish this at some point. And so Karol became friends with the Archbishop. It was Archbishop Voy-TEE-wah is his name, and he would go to confession with him, and the Archbishop would say, he's like, Karol, I know this, you're very angry about this, but you have to love, you have to persevere, and you have to make sure that you don't let anger get the best of you. And so, he really tried, and he spent tons of time in prayer, and he did the best that he could. And eventually, through that, he kind of determined that he wanted to become a priest. So he talked to the Archbishop, and the Archbishop said, okay, well, we do have an underground seminary that we've started up, but if you join this, it could mean a death sentence for you, because if they find it, or they find anybody in it, they're not gonna just let you go. It's gonna be an immediate death sentence for you. He says, I want to do this. I'm feeling called to do this. And so he starts in that seminary. And there were some of his friends, they were caught, and they were instantly killed. Literally, they'd find them, and they realized who they were, and they would just shoot them. It was extremely brutal. And I know that's hard to hear, but that's kind of what they were dealing with. And it was really bad. By the time the war was over 20% of Poland's population had been murdered. Okay, and so that's an incredibly huge number. And so I say it to give you the gravity of what was going on there, and what he was having to deal with. It wasn't just him going, gee, should I be a priest, or should I do this, or should I do this? He was like, him wanting to be a priest, and other people wanting to be Catholic, was a potential death sentence. Okay, and so this is really, really an important point. So he goes to seminary. They hold different things. He's still working at the quarry. He's still got to maintain that. At some point, he's transferred to a chemical factory, and some of the people there knew that he was kind of doing this, and so they would kind of cover for him so that he could do his prayers, because he was doing the breviary, so he had to maybe do prayers at a certain time of the day. He was doing some of his reading, and they would cover for him so that he could do this, because they knew that we need more priests. Again, this isn't just like now where a few people are Catholic. A lot of people are Catholic, are like, we need this. And so in 1945, the country is liberated by the Soviets. So again, I don't know how much you guys know about World War II, but the Americans and the Allies came from the West and kind of from the Northwest, and then also from the South. But the Soviet Union came from the East, because Hitler was fighting on two fronts. And so the Soviets were the ones that liberated Poland. But both Archbishop Voy-TEE-wah and Karol Wojtyla, they knew that the Soviets might not be any better than the Nazis. Both of them had read all of the communist stuff, all of Marx's works, and they realized that this was not a good ideology either. But, so they were very cautious about this. And, it turned out that they were right on that point as well. So in 1946, Karol is now Father Karol, and he is ordained to the priesthood. And so right away, people, had realized that he's got something about him. He's just got a way with people. And so he was also very intelligent. And so almost right away, the Archbishop sends him to Rome, which he feels is going to be safer. So again, Poland is occupied by the communists. Rome is basically free at this point in time. So he sends him there kind of to protect him, but also so he can further his studies. So he's in Rome from 1946 to 1948. And during that time, on a retreat, he takes a pilgrimage. It wasn't really a pilgrimage, but he takes a trip to San Giovanni Rotondo, which is straight east of Rome, kind of over on the eastern edge of Italy. And this is where Padre Pio is a friar. And some of you guys might remember talking about him last year. And he wanted to have his confession heard by Padre Pio. And he goes in just with a lot of other people, but Padre Pio kind of notices him. And he tells the friar, he says, there's something about that man over there, that priest. I feel like he's going to ascend to the highest office in the church at some point in time. They were thinking, well, he's going to be a cardinal or something like that. They never dreamed that this was a future pope. But after he left, Karol would send prayer requests to Padre Pio because he knew what a great intercessor he was. And later on in his life, he sent a request for one of his friends who, as a result of all the experiments that the Nazis had done on her, like doing chemical and biological tests on her, had developed cancer. And she wound up with a miraculous cure, like cured instantly through Padre Pio's intercession. And so they had kind of a friendship. They were more like pen pals, but they were definitely aware of each other. And so during this time, when Father Karol is a priest, he winds up really having an affinity to working with young people. And so he's taking youth and like people who are in their 20s, young adults, and he winds up taking them on like camping trips and canoeing trips and backpacking trips and ski trips and all those types of things. And he winds up just spending a lot of time with them, and he actually asks them a lot of questions. And he's talking with them about their relationships. And, what is it that, that couples want? What does a man want in a woman? What does a woman want in a man? And so they, over time, he started really kind of flushing this out in a philosophy that he was doing, and it later became known as theology of the body. But at the time, he wrote a book called Love and Responsibility, and it was a summary of all of the things that he had discussed with them and all the things he had learned, and he kind of synthesized all of it into this book. And later on, it winds up being a very important part of his theology, which we'll talk about in a minute. But at the age of 38, 1958, his archbishop, his friend, Archbishop Sapieha, dies. And so they need to replace, so that the auxiliary bishop becomes the archbishop, they need to replace the auxiliary bishop. And so since this was communist Poland, all of the candidates for the position had to go through the Communist Party in Poland. And they pretty much nixed everybody, and then they said, well, how about this Father Karol Wojtyla? And they said, yeah, he's kind of a dreamer, he's an intellectual, he's not going to give us too much problems. So they approved that one. And so even Father Karol, he's kind of like, I'm too young to be a bishop, but he saw that he needed to accept this. And so he's ordained a bishop at the age of 38, which is pretty young for a bishop. It's not unheard of, but it's pretty young. And so the Polish government, the Polish communists, got more than they bargained for. Within a year or so, they were starting to build this city. They were calling it like this utopian city where it was going to be like a worker's paradise, they called it. And so there was going to be free apartments and free labor, and meaning that they were going to be doing a lot of work for the state, right, to try and build up the state. But everything was going to be free, and people are going to be happy, and they were going to own nothing. But they're going to be happy about it, which unfortunately is what some people are trying to do to us now, again, okay? But that's a whole different story. But in this city, the Polish, I guess he was like the governor, he kind of looked, he goes, well, there's no church in this place, right? Even though he was working with the communists, he was kind of like, yeah, where's the church, And so they go, well, there's no church. It's this, what do we need a church for? It's the opiate of the masses. We don't need a church. And he's kind of like, okay. So this was kind of a crack in his armor of him kind of going like, I'm not so sure that what I'm doing is the right track. But anyway, so they start building this place, and people start moving there, and people don't have any access to their faith. Well, Father Karol finds out about this, and on Christmas, again, winter in Poland can be pretty brutal. On Christmas, he says, we're going to have Mass in the city. And they're like, you can't have Mass, there's no church. It's like, well, there's this big open area, we're going to have Mass there. And they're like, okay. So they take like a table, and they take this big cross, and they stick it in the ground there, and they're having midnight Mass. Well, just as they start, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of tanks and troops roll up, shine their lights on this, and the communists are there, and they're basically surrounding them, and they're threatening them. And he kind of stops Mass, and all of a sudden he just starts kind of orating about how, workers also have a freedom of religion, and they deserve this right, and all of a sudden all of the troops drop their arms, some of them take off their helmets, and they want to go to Mass. Because they realize he's right. Because even though these soldiers were part of the Communist Party, they realized that in their heart he was right. And so that's what they wanted. And so this got the attention of the Communist Party, and they didn't like what they heard, and so they started tailing him. They started following him everywhere. And this didn't seem to bother Father Karol. He was just kind of like, oh, okay, well, hey guys, how's it going over there? And he'd call them his guardian angels, and he'd wave to them, and he'd bless them, and he'd do all this kind of stuff. But they gathered information on him and sent it back to Moscow. And they said they took 18 boxes worth of information to Moscow about him. And at the time, and they presented this to Premier Khrushchev, who was not a good guy. He was also a hothead. And so basically they're like, we need to figure out a way to kind of get this guy out of the picture. This was a bad choice of making this guy a bishop. But they never really seemed to get anything on him, and they never really seemed to come in and arrest him, and they just kind of kept watching him. And it was just kind of weird, but you kind of figure throughout his whole life, he even made a comment. He says, so many of my friends died and I lived. How is that? And there's all these other priests that died and I lived. How is that? And he just kind of felt like he was being protected. And he says, he said that he felt like it was his devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and she was protecting him. And so the communists, they were in power there from 1945 until the 80s. Okay, and so it's like this went on for a long time. And so in the early 1960s, he was made an archbishop, and he wound up getting to go to the first of the Vatican II council sessions, and that was held in 1964, I believe. He was also he was a friend of Pope Paul VI, who was the Pope at that time, and so he became his Secretary General. He started helping him with things. He would go on trips for him and do all this other type of thing because, especially as he aged, Pope Paul VI was like, I can't do this, so I'm going to send this to you to do this as my envoy. And so he did. And so at that Vatican II Council in 1964 and 1965, he became fairly well known. People knew that this was a pretty smart guy, and we need to listen to some things. So they said that when he was there and they were talking in the intermissions, there was always a crowd around him, and he was always talking about some of the things that he had kind of been postulating, like the theology of the body, how the workers have rights, and all this type of thing, and also kind of like how are we going to prepare to enter the third millennium. Okay, this is in 1964 and 1965. He's already thinking ahead to what it's going to be like after the year 2000. Okay. And so, again, very much a forward thinker. So fast forward a little bit, and in 1978, Pope Paul VI dies. And so they need to elect a new pope. And so by this time, he had been doing so much for Pope Paul VI, Pope Paul VI made him a cardinal. Okay, so now he's in the College of Cardinals, so he gets to vote for the next pope. So they go to conclave, and you guys might remember, you're probably too young to remember when Pope Francis was elected. That was almost 10 years ago. But anyway, they get all the cardinals together, and they go into the secret, they close all the doors, they lock all the doors, and they just vote. And they discuss, and they vote, and they pray, and they decide who's going to be the next pope. And so they do this, and after a couple days, they elect a new pope. And it's, I can't remember, it's Albino Luciani is who they elect. And so that's not super important who it is, but he takes the name of Pope John Paul I. And because before Pope Paul was Pope John, so he says, I'm going to take what John and Paul did, and I'm going to keep it going. And he said, okay, that's great, but you can't be Pope John Paul I, because you don't usually name somebody the first until the second happens. And he goes, that's all right, I'm going to be Pope John Paul I because I'm not going to be Pope very long, and there's another one who's going to be coming after me who's going to be Pope John Paul II, and he's going to do much greater things. People are like, okay. 33 days later, he dies. Some say under very mysterious circumstances. And there's all sorts of theories about what happened and why it is. Nobody really knows. But anyway, he dies. And they have another conclave. And the whole world's kind of like, what's going on? But I remember this time, cool, we're waiting for the white smoke, to come out of the little chimney. And you didn't like it because there was a dead pope, but you liked it because it was kind of a cool process to learn about. At that time, I was 15 years old, so just a little older than you guys. And after a couple days, they elect Cardinal Voy-TEE-wah as the pope. And right before that, the Archbishop of Krakow, he came to me, he says, look, there's a chance you're going to get elected pope. He says, you can't turn it down, because there has not been a pope elected outside of Italy, someone who wasn't an Italian bishop, in 450 years. And this is something Poland really needs right now. So if you are elected, you need to accept it. And because he didn't want to accept it. He didn't want, I don't want to be pope. I mean, that's like, that's a huge job. But in his humility, that's kind of what he was thinking. And so anyway, so he accepts. And so they're walking him out to the balcony to kind of address the people. And as they're walking up, they're like, okay, all you have to do is give the apostolic blessing, and then we'll go back in and we'll start getting stuff set up for, for everything. And he's like, okay. And he just kind of throws that script out the window, and he's like, everybody, and he's like, the first thing he says is, be not afraid. And he says this in like 7 different languages, because he was like fluent in like 8 or 9 different languages at the time. And he says, I know I'm not an Italian bishop, and my Italian is not very good, so I know that if I make a mistake that you will correct me. And everybody just like fell in love with the guy that night. And it just really started rallying support around him. He just had this charism about him that he could talk to people, and they just loved him, okay? And probably because, they sensed this holiness, and they're like, I want to be around that person, okay? And so anyway, so he starts in, end of 1978. In 1979, he says, one thing I'm going to tell you guys right now is I am not going to be a prisoner in the Vatican. I'm not going to be here. I'm going to travel, and I'm going to go out and see the people. I'm going to be amongst the people, and they're going to know their Pope. And so he's sitting down with his advisors, and he says, I really feel the need to go to Mexico. And they go like, you can't go to Mexico. He says, they hate us there. They've been persecuting the Catholics for 100 years there. They don't even let the priests wear their cassocks in public. So we can't go to Mexico. And they said, furthermore, we haven't been invited. He goes, well, I'm sure you guys can set something up. And they're like, we can't do this. He goes, all right, well, let's go to Poland instead. And they go, all right, well, let's figure out a way to go to Mexico, because they knew going to Poland was going to be more difficult. And so they arrange it, and he goes to Mexico because he wanted to go to the Our Lady of Guadalupe shrine. He wanted to pay tribute to Our Lady there, and he does. And millions of people line the streets. And it's like more than the government can deal with. The government had been a Masonic government for 100 years. They'd been persecuting the Catholics, not as bad as they were in the 1920s when they were literally shooting the priests. They killed almost every priest in Mexico in the 1920s. And that was part of the whole Cristero Wars. It's a really good movie on that. I would recommend watching that. For Greater Glory, really good movie on that. So anyway, they go to Mexico, and people see the Pope out and about, and they're like, this guy's really great. And it's all television coverage and all this kind of stuff. And he comes back, and he's like, we need to go to Poland. They're like, we can't go to Poland. It's a communist country. He goes, figure it out. And he goes to Poland, and tens of millions of people come out to see him. Because again, it's a super Catholic country. And they just line the streets, and the communists are kind of going like, this is the beginning of the end. They knew right then that they weren't going to be able to prevail. And that was, again, in mid-1979. Shortly thereafter, a whole movement starts in Poland, a whole workers' party called Solidarity. That takes hold, and between the Catholic force and the labor force, they just kind of, in a way, push the communists out over the next decade or so. Same thing happens in Germany. Germany was East and West Germany, and when Berlin Wall falls without a shot being fired in 1989. And so it's just, a lot of people credit that to some of the politicians at the time. It was 100% Pope John Paul II who did that. And his efforts to go in and do what he could to bring Catholicism out in these people. Over the next decade or so, he just travels a ton. One of the things you guys probably had heard about is that there was an assassination attempt in his life. So on May 12th, 1981, he goes to a nearby hospital, which has just built a new wing. It's called Gemelli Hospital, and they want him to bless it. So he goes out there and he blesses the wing, and they have a brand new ambulance. And so he says he blesses the ambulance. He says, I also bless the first person who travels in the ambulance. The next day, he is out in the square, May 13th, 1981. May 13th. Some of you may or may not know that's the anniversary of the apparitions in Fatima. And so it's that anniversary. He's got a huge devotion to Our Lady. And so he winds up going out. He's out amongst the crowd, and all of a sudden he doesn't get too far, and all of a sudden a couple gunshots ring out, and he falls. And it's a gentleman who, and they arrest him right away. They pretty much, actually a nun tackled him, okay, because she saw what was going on, this nun, and I saw there's a video on YouTube about her. I want to watch it. I didn't get a chance to do that, but they get the guy and they rush him to the hospital. He is just gushing blood at this point in time, and they can't get him through the crowds hardly. But they said this time of day we need to go to this one hospital that's close to here. And they go, no, go to Gemelli, go to Gemelli. Go, that'll take a half hour in this traffic. They're like, go to Gemelli. All right, so they go. It takes them 8 minutes to get there. They get him to the hospital. They realize he's lost like almost all of his blood, yet he's still surviving. They do surgery on him, and he survives. They pull the bullet out. They realize if the bullet was literally 1 millimeter further to one side, it would have hit his aortic artery, and he would just gush blood. He would have been dead in 3 seconds. But it missed. And he later went on to say that, one hand shot the gun and another one guided the bullet, referring to Our Lady who protected him because of his devotion to her. So, 1 year later, he decides to go pay honor to Our Lady in Fatima. And on May 12th, again, the day before the anniversary, he's in the square, he's gonna celebrate Mass, and a priest from a separatist movement charges him and tries to stab him. And, his bodyguards kind of fight the guy off and he winds up going to celebrate Mass. He goes amongst the people, gets back to his thing at night and realizes he really was stabbed. Somehow he was stabbed and it lost some blood, but they just stitched him up and he was better after that. And so, so May 13th comes around, he goes and he has the bullet that they took out of him, and he goes to the statue of Our Lady, Our Lady of Fatima, and there's a crown, and he takes the crown off, he takes the bullet, and he looks, and there's this little slot, he takes the bullet and sticks it in. It fits exactly. No one knew what this little slot is for, but this bullet, which he just takes it, he puts it right in, and it's there. I got to go to Fatima about 9 years ago, and I got to see the crown. It was pretty cool. We were on a tour of the thing, and they weren't going to show it to us, but then the other people left, and my son and I were there, and the nun goes, "You want to see the crown?" I'm like, "Yeah, I want to see the crown." And so she goes, "Fine, but you can't take any pictures." Dang it. But she got, and so we were like this close to that crown with the bullet that shot John Paul. It was just super cool. But anyway, there was just always these attempts on his life. And so he's the reason they made the Pope Mobile. And so to protect him, so that from any snipers, any assassination attempts and things like that. And so, again, he's just doing his thing. But during this time, in the 80s, he starts having these Wednesday audiences, and he starts talking about this thing that he calls theology of the body. And this is basically a treatise on how, the dignity of the human person and how we are to be in our relationships. And so we actually talk about some of that in high school. We'll be talking about that, more as time goes on, but it's really important. And it really helps all of us know how we need to be chaste in our relationships, but also just at how we respect people in general. And so it's just really super important. They said that all of his writings on this, all put together, it's going to take us a century or two to really distill it out and realize the effects of his teachings on this. He will be a doctor of the church at some point in time. We don't know when. But his writings are just that important and that applicable to our lives. So anyway, in the 90s, he's getting a little bit older. He has kind of a bad fall. I can't remember if it was his hip or his leg that he broke, but they had to do surgery on that to rebuild his hip and his femur. And so it's really limited his mobility. He's now in he's like 73, 74. Up to this point, he was still hiking mountains. He was still skiing. There's a really cool story that Jason Everett tells in his book about he was skiing once, and there was this little kid, and he started skiing with him. And he's like, "You want to ski?" And he's like, "Yeah." And the kid's like, "This guy looks familiar," but they were skiing all morning, and the kid goes up to his mom, and he's like, "I just was skiing with the Pope." She's like, "Yeah, right, whatever." And then all of a sudden she turns around, he's like, kind of like that. Pope John Paul's like, she's like, "It's the Pope," and he had been skiing with him all morning. And so it's just kind of like, wow, so he was just this kind of a regular guy. There was all these reports of him sneaking out of the Vatican. They would put a hooded sweatshirt on him. Even once he was bound to a wheelchair, he would sneak out of the Vatican and go do stuff. He just wanted to kind of be out and amongst the people. In 1995, he was in the Philippines, and there was this, right before he got there, there was this apartment building near where he was going to be meeting, or where he was going to be presenting, and all of a sudden this apartment building catches fire. People are like, what's going on? They do this investigation, and apparently there were some people that had rented a couple of rooms there, and they were building bombs. And so they were going to make all these bombs, and they were going to make another assassination attempt on his life. Well, it turns out that a couple of the people that were doing this were also two of the people that had tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993 by setting off a bomb in the basement. And one of them was the cousin of one of the guys who flew the airplane into the World Trade Center. So there's like this, they were all part of the same group, and they were trying to just wreak havoc all over the world. But, you know, those people escaped, but, you know, their plan was foiled. There was another one, I can't remember where he was, but they discovered like 50 pounds of explosives underneath a bridge support over the route where he was going to be taking, like right before he did it. And so there was just tons of attempts on his life, and a lot of them were attributed to the KGB, the Russian Secret Service, and other ones were just other terrorist groups around the world that they just wanted this guy dead. But he always seemed to survive. But one thing that he said is that he would never wear a bulletproof vest. He's like, no, Our Lady's going to protect us. And he wouldn't let his guards wear a bulletproof vest either. He's like, you need to trust in Our Lady going to do this. Okay, so they did. And that was just how deep his faith was in it. And so anyway, so he's starting to age. He's got Parkinson's disease. He's got all these things going on. And if anybody should have retired, it was him. But in about 2000, 2001, he's like, no, he says, you know, that's not the way it's going to go down. He says, I'm gonna see this through the end. And by the time he died in 2005, he was wheelchair bound. His Parkinson's was so bad, he couldn't even hardly talk at times. And his last address was on Easter Sunday in 2005. And basically he wheeled up to the window and he didn't say anything. And the people just cheered, you know, because they just realized how much they loved him. And so about 4 or 5 days later, it was on the vigil of the Divine Mercy Sunday, which is a holiday that he helped institute about 3 years before that. He passed away on the vigil of that, and it was with millions of people outside singing to him, which is the way that he was born. He was born with the hymns to Mary, and he died with hymns to Mary being sung outside his window as well. And so there's just so much about this guy. I could go on for hours about him, there's so much about him. So I would just recommend you read this book. I'd recommend that you just get to learn more about him because he's just super, there's so much about him. There are the 5 loves that it talks about in here, and I won't go into them, but I talked about a number of them already. His 5 loves that said in here were young people, which was brought out in his creation of World Youth Day. Human love, which is what was brought out through theology of the body. The Blessed Sacrament. They had to hide where churches were on his routes, and if there was an adoration chapel in one of the buildings, they had to hide it. Otherwise, he would realize it, and he would go into the chapel, and he would be lost for hours in adoration, and threw off their whole schedule. The Blessed Virgin Mary is another one, and then the cross, where there's 5 loves. And then Jason goes into lots of different stories in here about that. So again, I would recommend that you read that book. Like I said, I know there's tons I could tell you about him, but we're going to run out of time if I do. And so I would just ask you to get to know him. That's all I could do. I mean, it's just like he's one of those guys I had no appreciation for him, virtually no appreciation for him when he was alive, certainly early on. One thing he did help me with personally is that in 1979, I remember that there was an article in the paper that said, the headline was that evolution and creation can coexist. And I'm like, what? And so through his teachings on theology of the body, he said that he re-emphasized the teaching of the church that evolution is a part of creation. And so that it's not one or the other, it's both. And I remember just being because in school they're teaching us all this stuff about, you know, it's evolution and nothing else in the church is wrong and it's antiquated and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, no, it's both. Evolution is a tool that God uses to bring about his creation. And I was like so relieved because I remember at like 17 years old, I was just like totally confused and I didn't know what to think about this. But he made me realize that the church is right about this, okay? Creation and evolution together. And not evolution exactly in the way that they teach in schools either, okay? And there's a whole lot about that we can talk about at another time. But that really helped me a lot in my faith when I was a teenager, realizing that, because I was being forced to choose when I didn't have to. You guys have any questions? All right. I do have another book up here if anybody's interested and wants to look through. There's just a lot of pictures of him in here through different times in his life. And it's put together by a guy named, what's his name? Oh, Joseph Ratzinger, who's a friend of his who became Pope Benedict right after him. All right. And so anyway, so Joseph Ratzinger put this book together about the life of John Paul. It's a bunch of pictures and things like that. It's really good. And then there's some things that he wrote in there about the Pope as well. With your journals, go ahead and open to the next blank page or the next blank space. Today's date is Wednesday, February 8th, 2023. And the title of this is When Adversity Knocks. I want you to think about John Paul's early life when you hear this. One time, a girl let out all her frustrations about her life to her father. She said that her life is full of setbacks. There seemed to be no end to her problems. Her father, a chef, led his daughter inside the kitchen. He took 3 same-sized pots and filled them with the same amount of water. He set the pots on the stove and turned on the fire. When the water started to boil, the father put ground coffee beans in one, some eggs in the second, and potatoes in the last. He quietly observed the 3 pots. The bored daughter stood there and was getting impatient with the silence and wondered why her father was cooking the coffee, eggs, and potatoes in front of her. 20 minutes passed, and the father turned the flames off. He spooned the potatoes from the water and transferred these to a bowl. Next, he took the eggs from the water and laid them in a second bowl. He poured the brewed coffee into a mug. He then asked his daughter, "What do you see?" To which he replied, "Coffee, eggs, and potatoes." The father said, "Take a good look and feel the potatoes." She touched it and stated that they were soft. The father asked her to break an egg. She did just that and shelled the egg. She stared at it, and it was a hard-cooked egg. Lastly, he gave her the mug of coffee and told her to drink it. Both the flavor and the smell of the coffee made the daughter smile. Finally, she broke her silence and asked her father, "What does this all mean?" The father answered, "All three of these face the same problem, the boiling water. But each of the three reacted differently. The potato was vigorous and sturdy when it went into the water, but ended up soft. The eggs were soft on the inside with only a thin shell protecting it, but when faced with the problem, it toughened up inside. But the ground coffee was different. It blended with the water and made itself and the water better." The father proceeded, "When a problem stares you in the face, which one would you like to be?"